a big welcome wherever you are tuning in from to the new operational norm, getting on the front foot as an industry. We feel that obviously we're all hoping and can't wait to the day when we're able to kind of press that green button and start moving forward. The reality is that there's lots that's going to come before we get to that. And, you know, one of the conclusions from this morning's session was that there's probably more questions than answers at the moment, but great to start talking about these potential challenges that we're going to face as we go forward. And I think I'm Chris Robb, by the way. I know lots of you, but many of you seeing names for the first time. Delighted to be joined by Mike Nishi, partner from Chicago Event Management in Chicago, and Hugh Singe, the managing director of Event Health Management, and also the medical director of the Singapore Marathon. And I'll throw to them in a couple of minutes to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. But my sense is that we as an industry have an opportunity here, without for one moment taking away the fact that some of the rules and regulations are obviously going to be dedicated by governments and health authorities, and there's going to be people like the World Health Authority making recommendations. But in this period of lull and pause, we have this opportunity to start coming together now, to start collaborating, to start thinking about what the new normal may be, so that we can hopefully start to get a seat at the table with some of these discussions that are happening, to be in a position where the industry is making suggestions and recommendations wherever the world that we may be, rather than waiting until the green light gets pressed. And then there's a couple of scenarios. We could get a bunch of rules that are imposed on us that have fairly onerous requirements and obviously commercial viability impact on us. And also from a timeline perspective, when Boston bombing happened, and I know many of you would have been impacted by that, that happened 3 weeks before a big cycling event that I had in Singapore with 11,500 participants. And we had to scramble fairly fast. The initial requirements that were asked were very onerous, and by a process of negotiation, we were able to moderate those to a degree to manage safety, but also manage budgets in terms of being able to move forward. Whilst there's lots and lots of questions, we at least have this opportunity with this likely extended period of time to start having some conversations that might be able to help moderate and mitigate the financial implications, whilst at the same time ensuring the safety of participants. So just a quick throw to myself in terms of background. I've been in the industry now for 35 years, started in South Africa, Australia, and latterly for about the last 15 years in Singapore. Been involved in a number of events in a race director role. For example, the Singapore Marathon, with at that stage 60,000 participants. I published mass participation sports events about 5 years ago to hopefully share some of my knowledge and help people in the industry. And what I'm passionate about as the CEO and founder of Mass Participation World is trying to bring the industry together, promote collaboration, see how we can work together in these kind of forums, education and so on. So there's a number of initiatives that I've got running at the moment. Every Monday I have a session at 8 a.m. Singapore time and 8:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. called Strength in Numbers, which is literally an open chat room in Zoom where anyone is welcome to join. I just need to register for the first time, and we just literally chat for an hour, hearing insights of what's happening around the world, sharing challenges, and some people prefer to just come on and listen, which is absolutely fine as well. I'm now rolling into, I've been doing some of these webinars / masterclasses on a more ad hoc basis, but I've now got a program that I'm going to be rolling out every Friday at about this time, depending on where our speakers are from. If we'd gone a bit earlier, Mike would have been getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning, which probably wasn't the right thing to be doing. So appreciate him getting up at 6 a.m. anyway. And then the other initiative, which I launched 2 weeks ago, is called the Aid Station, and it's short little 15-minute interviews with people from all over the world, pre-recorded on Zoom and published daily during the week on the Mass Participation World YouTube channel and various other platforms. And the idea really being able to share what people are going through around the world, to inspire, to make us recognize that we all have challenges. And sometimes when we hear one person talking about their challenge, it may resonate with us or provide a solution for us. So very open. We've had some amazing guests so far. We had Andrew Messick this week. We had Andrea, who's on the call, who heads up mass participation from RCS in Italy. We had Phil Liggett last week, and lots of what I call ordinary people, just amazing people in small roles in small businesses. So if you've got anybody who you think would be great for the show, drop me an email, chris@chrisrobb.asia, and of course, very happy to help in any other ways. But enough about me, some quick housekeeping. I've muted everyone coming into the call, so please, if you wouldn't mind, stay mute. If you've got any questions, I've got the chat box up and I'll be following that on the way through. We'll have some time for ongoing questions that I'll be reading out as we go through. And we've kind of broken it down into probably, I think, 7 different areas. We're going to start off by talking about some of the guidelines that are in place, government, World Health Authority. There's no real guidelines in place, but the initiatives that are being taken to try and put those in place. A recent initiative with the likes, for example, of World Athletics, IIRM, UCI, and ITU working together to provide some guidelines. Then we're going to talk about medical requirements and availability. We're then going to touch on the participants, what we might need to put in place for participants from the health check perspectives and checking and so on, testing. We'll then spend a bit of time on the operations element of it. We'll talk about staffing, something that I'm sure is on everybody's mind, costs and budget implications. And we'll touch a little bit, whilst none of us are legal experts, on possible legal and liability issues. And that's a lot to get through. This morning we went for about an hour and 15 minutes, which is fine with the 3 of us panelists. Realize that some people might want to drop off after an hour, and that's absolutely fine. We'll do our best to get to as many of the questions as we can, and if we can't, we'll try and circle back to you, whether that's via email or the likes. Jan Schubert, if you wouldn't mind just muting yourself there, please. You've just come on the call. Thank you. And this is being recorded, and this morning's one was recorded and will be uploaded to the Mass Participation World YouTube channel if you want to share with friends and colleagues. So I'm delighted again. Thank you, Mike, for joining us so early in Chicago. Just give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself, and then Hugh to introduce himself before we get into the meat of it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Hugh, for joining again and giving us this opportunity to address so many concerns and come up with some shared solutions. And it's great to see so many familiar faces as well, and look forward to connect, and just remind me to connect with so many friends in our industry. I think that a lot of you might know me. I work for Chicago Event Management out of the Chicagoland area. We produce and work on several events in and around Chicago. I've been involved with the Chicago Marathon indirectly since 1982, when I was just a kid in high school, working and trying to get involved, stay involved with the event any which way I could. Starting to work full-time on the marathon in 1989, and then became a partner with Kerry Pinkowski, the executive race director of the Bank of America Chicago Marathon, in 1989. And, we formed a company, Chicago Event Management, in 96, and we're able to basically see the growth of the marathon from where it was years ago to where it is today. So we've been fortunate to be able to guide this marathon along and watch it grow over the time. And obviously, because of that and our relationship with Abbott World Marathon Majors, been able to connect with so many people globally and continue to develop that network, sharing those best practices globally. So thank you again, Chris and Hugh, for this opportunity to work with so many of our friends and partners in our industry, sharing and learning from one another.
Thanks, Mike, and so many great initiatives. I mean, I listened in on your race management program call last night. I was lucky enough to be a guest of yours at Chicago last year, which was absolutely fantastic, an incredible event. So congratulations and thanks. I know you've got a lot on your plate at the moment. Really appreciate you making time. And someone else who has a huge amount on his plate as well, Hugh, busy with starting to plan forward, obviously, for Singapore Marathon and scenarios, which I know you'll probably share with us. But love you to share a little bit about your background, please.
Yes, thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here as well, and thank you, Mike, for being available. It's nice sitting here and listening to you as well. I get as much as everyone else does. My background in this industry, I fell into the industry a number of years ago, like a lot of people did, and loved it. So when I look on it now, I start talking more towards being closer towards working in the industry for more more like 20 years than 10. I'm starting to tick closer on that end. And I'm very fortunate to be the face of an organisation, of a wonderful team that does a lot of work. I'm not backwards in saying that they make me look good at what I do. There's about 700 odd people in our team across the Asia Pacific region. And those people work day in, day out, and most of the time in a space that we're not the topic of conversation. And it's fair to say for the majority of the team that they quite like living in the shadows and doing what they do. These times are a little bit different. As you alluded, Chris, one of the events that we're privileged to be involved in is the Standard Chartered Singapore Marathon, and it's certainly a unique event. It's building in profile over the years, and an event very well. And my role there over the last few years since I've taken up the role as medical director has become a favourite on the calendar by way of nature of the event and the environment it's in, and just the sheer rush of the number of smiles at the end of the day. So that's probably a little bit about my background and where I came into this from.
Thanks, Hugh. And if you don't mind, we might stay with you to kick it off, just to get some insight into some of the initiatives that are happening. As we shared on this morning session, lots of questions still around, no clear guidelines for mass events, but things starting to happen with groups formed, WHO putting groups together for guidelines, the initiative that I shared earlier. I'd just love to get from you, please, a sense of what you're seeing in the kind of government regulatory space, which may impact on the decisions that are made and also give some guidance for how we move forward.
Sure. I did allude in session one that I was hoping to answer a couple of questions, but I should probably prelude that by saying I'll probably aim to add 300 more to for everyone that we maybe answer. The space at the moment around government and agencies is unique. It's a very rare scenario that we see every country around the world facing the same threat, but different situations. We see different circumstances in the US and the UK, large parts of Europe, than we do in other parts of the world. Every country at the moment has a different trajectory. We've all become very familiar with the term curve and what it means, and hoping to flatten the curve across every country. We are in a spot where advice from agencies, from governments is plentiful and overwhelming, frankly, most of the time. And largely that advice is focused around the acute management of the pandemic itself. As far as we sit as an industry at the moment, we're in a spot where governments haven't started providing direction or guidance towards mass participation because it hasn't quite got onto their radar yet. We're starting to see them ask questions. We're starting to see them answer questions that are asked of them about how will things look when we come out the other side of this. And at the moment, the discussions from all layers of government around the world, all agencies from WHO through to other health organisations, is simply that mass participation in any mass gathering environment is obviously going to be one of the last measures that we see lifted universally. They haven't got to the point of providing specific guidance at this point. Some countries that are more fortunate than others are further along that curve. It has plateaued, or in very few countries around the world, it has started to come down temporarily, albeit a lot of awareness around second and third waves. Those countries that are further down the curve and fortunate to be in a position to start maybe thinking about what it looks like are very much in the open of, where do we start? We haven't faced a pandemic. How do we deal with this in our environment, where in the globalized world of travel, what does it mean for putting large groups of people together? And the simple answer is no government or health organisation has an answer to provide clear guidance as to how to do that. So there's a really big opportunity here for us as an industry to come up with some ideas and put them up and discuss them and work out what may or may not be achievable, what may achieve what we're looking to do, what may be feasible. And that way, we're not waiting for government and agencies who are preoccupied with larger priorities at the moment to come back and tell us how to do things in our environment again.
Thanks, Hugh. Mike, some comments from your side. Obviously, very involved with the authorities in Chicago, and one of the discussions we had earlier is even managing to find the time to get a slot on their calendar at the moment with so much on. But just some insights in maybe you're doing some work with Running USA and other groups as well. But some of the things you might have seen in terms of guidelines and where that might be heading, please.
Yeah, sure. And Hugh is spot on in terms of everything that he communicated. And, things are different depending on the region of the world that you're from and local agencies and what the requirements are. So obviously the great work that obviously WHO, World Athletics, and have been doing together to come up with these guidelines will be extremely helpful to all of us, regardless of where you are. And again, there's going to be a lot of great information and guidelines that you can pull out and apply. And a lot of us will be re-entering, hopefully, the market and having events at different times. And hopefully you can take some of those learnings and some of those practices and implement them so you're better prepared. So at that moment or time that we can get back running and hosting mass participation events, you'll have some guidelines to work with. Some of the things that we have been talking about, as I mentioned earlier, is we've been doing a lot of work with Chicago Area Runners Association and Greg Hipp here. They're one of our nation's largest running clubs and advocacy groups. And we've been talking in terms of, as things get back to normal, as Hugh alluded to, a lot of the focus is the crisis currently. So we haven't had an opportunity to take a lot of their time to talk through what those guidelines might look like, especially from a permitting standpoint. I know that everyone has to go through some type of permitting application process with their local governments, with their departments. And, I think this is a good opportunity for us to come together within our local markets to develop some of that criteria or those requirements, so we can illustrate that we can safely host these our events in our environments. So as Hugh said, that we don't receive these generalized specific requirements from these different departments from a permitting process that would be really difficult for us to abide by. And this will give us really the opportunity to give us greater control in the overall process. So, the collaboration is going to be key, and working on these guidelines together is going to be, I think, important. And I think it's going to be appreciated as well with those departments or agencies. From our standpoint in Chicago, there's certain requirements in our permit application that included, as time goes on, whether it's started off with just general maintenance, then it included, sustainability, and then security for, like what Chris had mentioned, after 9/11, after Boston bombing, those requirements got a lot stricter and required a lot more detail. Now you're going to see more, I believe, in the permit process that will include, more medical related, safety related requirements. So again, this is our opportunity to work with them to develop something that we feel that are realistic, that we could actually implement, versus, again, these generalized requirements that I think these departments will come up with that just won't make sense for us and that we couldn't abide by.
Thanks, Mike. Some great insights there as well. I'd like to move now on to, once we get to this stage of, we've got some guidelines, we've got some requirements, we've got permits in place. One of the big challenges, which I think maybe some of the industry doesn't recognize the big challenge that it's going to create is just getting medical teams on the ground. The term that we used in our planning call, and again, you reiterated this morning, Hugh, is battle fatigue. All these health workers doing incredible work on the front line across the globe. There's the time that's being put in, that absolute fatigue. But the point that you made on our planning call as well is that many of these people run businesses. At the end of the day, hospitals run as businesses, private clinics run as businesses, and their business is being put on the back foot at the moment whilst they're dealing with this epidemic. So elective surgery and all those kind of things. So even if they're not absolutely fatigued when they come out of this, they may not have that bandwidth to sit in planning meetings, to be able to support events, at the weekends and be available. And just, again, you better than any of us on here can give some great insights into what that may look like and the ability. And I know Mike shared some great examples this morning. We can come back to him afterwards, but I'd love to get your kind of background into that.
It is a complicated situation in many ways. That you've hit and summed it up perfectly. There's an extraordinary pull on resources at the moment in every country. Hospitals normally run on a baseline of resources, and they are used to dealing with surges at particular times of the day, particular times of the week, particular seasons of the year. Depends on where you are in the world to when that flu season hits. There are a lot of normal surge periods. What we're looking at the moment, obviously, is an extraordinary surge on resources, but it's more than that. The world's media is focused on COVID and the extra resources placed on it. Hospitals, as you say, Chris, are businesses. They are operations and fairly large ones. A lot of people involved in managing them are now very much hands-on, all hands in to be able to look after patients. Businesses normally is not there. They have a range of issues they're dealing with, from staff welfare, additional people that are new to their facilities. There's a range of headaches that they have, and that's only dealing with this particular virus. We're not thinking about all the people in community who are normally not accessing the hospital. There are still a range of other healthcare requirements that need to be met, and at the moment in a lot of places aren't being met because it's second priority to dealing with a pandemic. We are dealing with a health system that is stretched, and that's the very reason we have measures in place. There are only so many doctors, nurses, beds, and essential workers to manage the situation. When it comes to our space in mass participation, we have a large requirement on medical resources, both personnel and equipment, and pulling those people in potentially in the second half of the year, when they have gone through a period of 6 months or longer in acute care, many of them 7 days and 12 plus hours. And when I say 12 plus, there are some people at 14, 15, there are some at 16, 17, 18 hours. It is certainly not unusual for some of those personnel to be doing longer than 24 hours. They are mentally and physically exhausted. And when it comes down to dealing with the acute crisis, that healthcare system is still operating on a day-to-day basis. They still have patients who currently don't have access to beds. They still have hospitals to manage on the other side of it. And very much like when you see a hurricane come through, there's a cleanup at the end of it as well. So we are talking about resources that come from that space where it's all hands on deck at the moment. So you're very right that as the industry looks to look potentially at the second half of the year and more so into 2021, when we get to that early stage of rebound and getting events back up, there will be limited resources. And of the resources that are available, some of the personnel that have put their hand up year in, year out and have that deeper working knowledge of particular events and teams and procedures may not be available. They may have to go back to extended work because of their personal circumstances. They may not be able to be released from their work yet. They may simply be so tired that they need time away from that environment because of the nature of what they've been dealing with. All of those factors will play a part in what resources are available. I think the one thing we probably can't underestimate, and this is the rosy part of the story after the glum part of it, is we have seen those people come to the forefront every year for however long, and they will keep doing it because they, just like every runner, enjoys turning up on race morning and seeing the crowds turn up, the nerves on the start line and the start of the race, and people having those moments of achieving PBs, and is often the medical teams that are there as they literally struggle over the lines, and there's an addiction to that part too. So while they're not normally noticed, I think maybe that softens some of the blow of the glum minute or so I've just spent talking about the realities of that battle fatigue.
Thanks, Hugh. Mike, coming back to you again, I mean, this morning, I think you shared an example that you required 2,000 volunteer medical staff, which a lot have come from medical colleges and whatever. And the reality is that those colleges are now shut until January 2021. just a small problem. Where do you find 2,000 people without being able to make contact through the colleges? I mean, some of those insights just invaluable.
Yeah, and what Hugh had mentioned, it's going to be a lot of battle fatigue. With a lot of the schools that won't even start until the beginning of next year, it's going to be really difficult to do any type of recruiting. I know that we could, potentially start recruiting and filling some of those voids or roles, but as we talked about as well from a financial aspect, it is going to take a lot of additional resources to onboard, a new type of pool of volunteers. There's Hugh had mentioned last night or this morning on your time that a lot of people and from the medical fields and professions and volunteers like to come back, and they know their roles, and the training the curve isn't as steep in terms of getting them introduced or back into their respective roles. So that would be a financial burden, and I know that will take a lot more time from an education and training standpoint. And I think that the conflict that we have there as well is, you just can't reasonably recruit right now in this type of environment. So our recruiting window needs to be shorter, and obviously then our training needs to ramp up. So it's going to be really challenging when it comes to that, and recruiting volunteers and getting them ready for their respective roles. And the other thing that we talked about is with the hospitals and what they're going through, and a lot of the ERs and elective surgery has been set aside so they can keep the operating rooms and ICUs open and clear for these obvious cases that need those types of resources, which obviously makes absolute sense. The other part is, is it reasonable or responsible on our part to have an event in the fall? They could have still locking down some of those ICUs and operating rooms for emergency cases as they prepare or expect additional spikes later on in the year. And so, in 2007, as everyone's familiar with in Chicago, due to the heat, we had to cancel the event midway, and we overwhelmed the medical systems and EMS services. So could we responsibly have an event that you never know what the weather could be? And then, we would have a medical system collapse due to, some of those issues and related issues that we have with an endurance event and distance like the marathon. So those are all things that we need to continue to think about, not just the recruiting, obviously the hospital resources, the impact that we would have on those types of facilities, and especially when the weather comes into it, you can't predict, and you do take a lot of resources, or require a lot of resources to be able to deal with that type of situation. So those are all things that obviously we need to keep in mind and consider, and continue to work with our local agencies. The other part that, as Hugh mentioned, in terms of the length of time and hours, as you can imagine, our emergency management groups as well, our OAMC, our operation, our Office of Emergency Management Communication, are just working overtime. We know individuals there that are working 7 days a week, on call 24 hours a day, and they're working 14 hours. I have a friend that works there, and he moved out of his home with 3 children because he's going to these different affected areas, and he's afraid to bring it back. So he's been living at his the basement of his in-laws, and hasn't been able to get home, and just been working 7 days a week like that. So when we come out of this, they're going to be exhausted as well, and are they going to be ready to provide those types of resources for us for an event, and they'll be continue to work and plan and prepare for those different spikes that are taking place. And lastly, I'll say is, and it might be different here, and our McCormick Place, our convention center, they have 3 field hospitals that they've built out in there, and they're going to leave them there for a few months at least. And if they are spiking, later in the year, they're going to continue to use those facilities. So when are they going to be available for our expo to be able to utilize? And as Hugh will mention, the whole quarantine and how they're going to do they kind of talk through the cleaning process, and there are days that they're going to start the cleaning. They have to let it sit for a quarantine period. And so, we don't know when realistically, if they use those facilities heavily, when they would be available for an expo like ours, that require that type of space to have people pick up their packets. So again, there's so much more that's happening, especially in our market, that will have to contend with and keep our eye on, from this day forward and every week as we approach the fall.
Wow, thanks, Mike. That's a new one that you didn't share this morning. That's amazing. This is the thing: is all these knock-ons, isn't it? We keep talking about the calendar alone. Is even if all of our medical staff were available, the calendar crush that we're going to have in fall or in the start of 2021 when we come up again, it's going to be virtually impossible to service, not only from a medical but other perspectives. Thanks for those great insights. I'd like now to move on to the participants, and we spent a fair bit of time on this morning's call talking about testing. How do we let participants come and be involved in the event? Is it a medical certificate? Is it testing stations? Is it checkpoints as they arrive? When do those happen? And one of the points that you made, Hugh, is that there's no silver bullet. The vaccine in reality is far down the track, but the testing is getting better and better and better. And we might have short-term testings, but with that comes a whole bunch of logistical challenges. With that comes liability issues. So someone comes up, you test them, they test positive, you turn them away. It's a false positive. You've taken away the opportunity of them participating in the event when they could have. There's a whole bunch of logistical and potential liability issues around that. Be great for you to talk to that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, the outlook in terms of participants is really complex. We know that we want people to have that experience, and social distancing and mass participation are mutually exclusive. They simply just don't go together no matter how far we try. We can modify it. We can reduce the sizes of people together, but in reality, it's a large part of the buzz, the experience, and what is unique about it. So to look at how do we get up and going, at what point in time, there's naturally a discussion that's evolving that's focusing on testing. And is there an ability to integrate testing to create a solution or part of a solution to enable us to put those people through check-in, get them into the pens, and then send them off down the road? Yes, there probably is at this point. Instead of focusing in on a particular type of test or a particular point of testing, the approach that our team's been modelling at the moment and working through to work out, is this possibly viable, has been focused around what parameters do we need that test to operate at for it to become an option to us. Not looking at all the different tests that are popping up, we've taken the approach of identifying what parameters do we need the testing procedures to meet. And it's not quite as simple as testing people to see if they are immune through the presence of antibodies. It's also not a case of excluding people by confirming that they're not COVID positive. There are a range of complications that some people are probably more familiar with. Those who deal with anti-doping or are familiar with some of the anti-doping processes would understand the complications around false negatives. It's not a straightforward procedure for us to be able to say this particular line of testing will give us this. We're looking at what sort of testing setup may give us parameters that would play a major part in the picture of getting participants to the start line. At what point that occurs is still up in the air. Closer and immediately prior to the race would be the obvious time for us, and what seems to have come to the front of most of the modelling we're looking at, mainly because of the immediacy of that test result. But it is certainly not the silver bullet that we're hoping for or anyone would like to find, because there isn't one. There is very much going to be a multifactorial approach as to how safe it is for people to compete. Will testing be a part of that picture? I think it possibly will be, but at this point, most of the development around testing has focused on testing for the purpose of purposes other than getting people to the start line. This disease is new. This disease is only been around in the forefront of most people's minds since January. It has been around really, it looks like mid-November last year from most of the evidence that health agencies can see around the world, where it first popped up, and obviously takes some time to identify. So at this point, the majority of development that's going into testing is focused around what testing do we need to understand what this virus is doing, what testing do we need to understand the virus better, and of course a lot of investment is focused on anything that will give us information to lead down that path of vaccine. The testing that has been created and is being developed at the moment is not focused around instant point of care testing with a short turnaround to enable us to put people on the start line. At some point, as we find more and more information, we find different variations of tests will come to the front and start to become available. So it is a very complex situation, and something that as time evolves will become clearer. But as you started off with that question, Chris, it's certainly not going to be a silver bullet. There's going to be a lot of layers to this.
Thanks, Hugh. Just a reminder to everyone, I've got the chat box up. If there's any questions that you'd like to be popping in there as we go through, I'll do my best to bring them to the panel. Mike, maybe, something we didn't touch on this morning, we've just spoken about testing of participants, and we didn't kind of take an elite angle to it. So, your event and, a number of events around have the elite. So, that adds an extra layer of complexity to it as well, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, whatever type of testing or standards that we would need to include for any participant, that they would have to go through that as well. So again, we don't know what that's going to look like, as Hugh alluded to, but it's going to be complex. And again, whether it's things that you're looking for, those antibodies, as Hugh had mentioned, and that's one thing. And when he said it's going to take time, and I think we have to accept that taking time could be beyond this year. And, again, that's not a great outlook, but it's a realistic one. And those are things that I think our industry has to accept. A lot of these things are going to just take a lot more time than what we would hope, that could, and how that impacts our events. The other part is, you heard about temperature readings and fever readings, and obviously that it's great if you can do that and have more time and you can integrate and get back to some type of to the office and get people to work again. But it's going to be really difficult in terms of the variances in temperature, the equipment that you have, and it's there's a lot of inconsistency when it comes to that. And as I mentioned, there was a good article that was provided by iCrowd by Dr. Stuart Weiss and with Intelligent Crowd Solutions, and really, opened my eyes in terms of how difficult or complicated it is just by taking temperatures. So again, that's not a silver bullet. It's another method, and I don't want to discredit it. But again, those are things that people have to do in terms of really understand what's available. In different scenarios is, again, I think the other part that's difficult is what happens if you do have a positive through your testing and someone shows up and they're sick. What is your policy enforcement? How are you surveying everyone coming in, and how do you contain and quarantine? So just because you can do a test and you identify who the individual is, and you got to remember, it's like your exhibitors, and to Chris said, your elite field, to your volunteers. And in Chicago, we have, including the medical field volunteers, we have 12,000 volunteers. So in addition to all the participants, you have a whole workforce that you're going to have to consider for testing as well. And if you have a positive, what do you do? So it's the same thing. You need a process and a policy and enforcement to be able to manage that number of people. And again, I don't think we're prepared for that either at this time. And I think that's going to be, you're going to need to include that as part of your preparation and planning if you have a way to do testing on site or at your event.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, very complex. There's a question in here from Michael Kutate. Apologies if I haven't got your pronunciation, Michael. Just saying, like, human nature, once this goes, when it moves out of the media a little bit, people come out, they want to be part of it. I think maybe that's the case. I mean, one of the examples that I was talking about on Monday on our Strength in Numbers call is that they opened up the beaches in Jacksonville, I think it was, in Florida, and the people came pouring out. There were pictures of people cheek by jowl on the beach in the middle of it. And I think that's one point, is that participants might want to come out. But the other part of it is that as race organizers, promoters, wherever we sit in the ecosystem, we have a duty of care and we have a responsibility. So it's going to be fine to say, okay, great, I've got 10,000 people. We were just touching on elite. So you imagine Mike's got a bunch of the best male and female athletes in the world there. There's a blip in testing, and one of them leaves the race with COVID and their season is broken. What's the liability to Chicago event management on the fact that they may be able to prove that the testing and the screening failed, and let alone where that might lead to from a liability perspective down the track in terms of participants, volunteers getting sick? Do you want your event to be an event that's kind of in the media? We speak about taking it out of the media, but is in the media for all the wrong reasons. And there's a case at the moment where Liverpool played their Champions League match, and I've had a momentary blank. I'm a Liverpool fan, but I've had a blank on the team they were playing from Spain. But there's now belief that match has contributed to COVID in Liverpool. So as an organizer, do you want to risk being in the situation where that's the brush that you're tarnished with? There was another question about travel. When do we open up travel? I think what's going to happen with travel is that travel's going to be so far down the track. We have quite regularly on these calls on a Monday, we have Auckland Tourism, and they were sharing that they've already started to recognize that their regrowth is probably going to happen from the counties around Auckland, and then maybe New Zealand wide, and then maybe internationally. But I think if we're event organizers that are pinning our hopes on the fact that in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, people are suddenly going to be getting on planes and traveling all over the world, I think it's probably going to require a rethink. Let's move on to the operations, and obviously very complex, lots of different things to talk about there. Mike, one of the things that we spoke about in planning the call and this morning was this whole chain of custody: food, water, medical supplies, quarantining, all of those, let alone when we get into things like, how do we manage logistically all of the testing stuff, access control, water stations, waste disposal, the impact on sustainability. All these events have moved to a great place from a sustainable, or lots of events, and yours is a glowing example of a much more sustainable event. But now people are saying, well, plastic is maybe actually quite good because you can be wiping it down at regular basis and regular times and disinfecting it. So there's all these kind of contradictions and questions. But I'd love you just to maybe spend a few minutes talking about the whole operation. You've been doing quite a lot of stuff, and I guess this is one of the things that can be done in this little pause that we're in at the moment, is to start modeling some potential operational scenarios. And it'd be great to get some of your insights there, please.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate that. And, there's 3 different areas that we've been really focused on. And, and these are practices that we've been doing, and we're definitely enhancing and modifying them, and we'll be implementing them, and even implementing them and continuing to do so, beyond COVID. And I think these are just good practices to include overall. There's 3 different areas that we've been focusing on as from an operational aspect, and underneath there's so many different things that you have to focus on under each bucket, I'll say. And I apologize because we can go on for a couple of days, 2-3 days, just talking about any one topic, and it goes down, and there's so many threads that go down on strings that are attached. But just real quick, we look at the environmental safety. And when I say environmental safety, we're talking about maintenance, the cleanup, how do you properly dispose of items that are, been touched, or masks or gloves. The other is like general cleaning, and just getting prepared and throughout the day in the sanitization process. So there, as you've seen, there's regular cleaning schedules in terms of before you walk in and throughout the day, at the end of the day, and what does that look like? And you're talking every single space. So no matter where you are, whether it's at the expo, whether it's on the bus transportation, whether it's at the volunteer check-ins, whether it's, going through the entire process and a journey of the of event staff, the journey of a volunteer, the journey of a participant. Those are all things that we're taking a look at. And what is our practices when it comes to cleaning and sanitization? What do those resources look like in supplies, the PPEs, the personal protection equipment, for the frontline people, and those are the things that we have to take a look at, and who's responsible, which is a financial burden as well. One thing that we didn't talk about a lot is like with Chicago, because of the, concern for safety and security, we have checkpoints that are screening individuals, and you're stacking people up. So you got to keep that in mind when you're doing testing and you're having people line up, and there could be someone that's infected, and you're pushing that bubble further out to stage people. You need more space if you need to continue social distancing just to check them from a security standpoint, let alone test them for any type of fever spikes. So those are all things that you need to keep in mind, from an operations aspect. The other part is, from a crowd management. And I know Marcel Altenberg from Manchester Metropolitan University is on here. And we're doing a lot of work with him with Start Right and modeling, and in terms of what's that crowd flow, what's that crowd management look like. It's one thing to be able to create space through time, like at an expo. The more time you have, the more space you can create. You can go from a 2-day expo to 3 days and multiple hours in a day. And of course, naturally, that's going to spread people out. You can assign people when they can come, et cetera. So you can create that distance or physical distancing. But, the most difficult part is you got to get them going and collected at one time, or at different moments. But you have a shorter window to get people staged to get them going on the course. Then naturally on the course, it's going to elongate from 2 hours to 6.5, 7, whatever your cutoff time is. And through the finish, it's going to flow through. But you need to get them staged and started. So we're looking at different models with Marcel in terms of, can we extend the start over a longer period of time, so you can get people based on the different waves coming in through these checkpoints at graduated times, at different scheduled times, so you can manage the flow, manage the groups that are coming in to create a little bit more distance. But it's a really complicated, and it takes a lot of time. I've been working on, at least 3 weeks with Marcel on these different models, and, really understanding, can we manage the spacing into the park, through the security, to the toilet lines, to gear check, into the corrals, onto the course, different pinch points that are on the course. You go from wide streets and to narrow, you're creating a bottleneck. And, even with aid stations, as you take over some of the streets to do that, what does that do to your crowds and getting people closer with volunteers? So again, it's complicated. So that's the other part from, distancing. And then finally, food safety. A lot of talk about, how do you manage and distribute food and gels on course, and most importantly, water. Again, do you have open cups and plastic bottles? And, plastic it is a solution, but it's not the silver bullet. You still have to handle the product. You still have to handle the packaging. And no matter how you distribute it, there's a potential risk there as well. So open cup or bottle, it's still a vessel in terms of, you got to hand it out to the individual. So those are all things that we got to look at, that personal protection equipment, whether it's the shields, the masks, the gloves, a lot of the training in terms of what that expectation is, additional hand washing stations for those volunteers, hand sanitization, anywhere there's volunteers that are gathered to do that type of work. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought about the security, but with all the security guards that we have, when I talk PPE, it's like all of a sudden, who's responsible for that financial burden? If I'm hiring this security group, these maintenance teams, is it the event's responsibility to provide that? But then again, like we talked about, there's then a liability, right? And it's like, as soon as you provide something or you don't and you miss someone, now that's an increased liability on us. If we didn't provide it to a security guard or a maintenance person, and all of a sudden it's our responsibility. So basically it makes more sense for those contractors, those vendors to be their responsibility, and then to ensure that that's in your agreements. So there's that whole liability standpoint from a legal aspect, and then from insurance, and ensuring that you have all that included in your agreements and contracts going forward.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, what it really highlights, just so complex, isn't it? And so much work that needs to be done around it. There's a whole bunch of questions popping through here. Let me see if I can pick up a couple of them. I mean, one from Ben Williams, I think, was talking about, will it be a little bit like airport security, how you come through? Would it be possible that people have like a COVID passport? But I guess the reality is, you have a passport today, you get infected tomorrow, your passport becomes invalid, so to speak. I'm guessing, and Hugh, maybe you can pick up on that, the whole, the setup at airports, you're confined, you're not in an open space, you've got all the equipment and all that kind of stuff there. Another quick one, and I'll maybe just throw all these out there, and then you can respond as we go through. As many would have seen, Berlin, German government has extended. They're now saying no more than 5,000 people. And the question is, does that include volunteers? What about spectators? How do we control spectators? Talk of the Tour de France going ahead with no spectators. There was a case study, and Mike, I'm sure you were probably involved in some of the discussions in Tokyo when they held the elite marathon only with no spectators there. Just want to pick up on a couple of these without losing the common thread too much. But there seems to be like, maybe we're going to have less big events and more small spread out events. I guess maybe that's a possibility. But just a couple, and maybe come back to you, Hugh, on the operational things, and either you or Mike just weave in some of those answers to some of those questions if you think you'd like to address them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll touch on a couple of them. I think all of them are great questions, and just highlighting to everyone how fortunate they are just to have heard Mike talk through so many different points there. And as he alluded to, the trails that they go down to. And he's really only touching on the surface at how far this chain goes. So I think you said the question from Ben in regards to sort of passport style checks, and is that something that we'd be expecting to see with testing? Possibly. To highlight some of the layers underneath what that system would look like. Whenever you go to an airport and you've got passport and security control checks, essentially you're entering a secure zone. You've got a sterile area, and that sterile area is a security sterile area. For us to conduct testing in a health setting and allow people to go through, there is clearly an expense, and that's a discussion that no doubt will come up shortly. But we can't go through the process of checking people to the nth degree within a parameter that we're confident of, and then put them into an area in itself that is potentially contaminated. It in itself, in a health setting, while not sterile, would not be considered a clean area. And if it were a contaminated or potentially contaminated area, when you put large numbers of people moving through it, particles of virus can be moved around very quickly. And that's obviously the worst case outcome. I think to highlight what a solution to that looks like, while the testing itself and that entry process might resemble something that looks like an entry process to a concert or to a stadium or an arena, or very much that security check that you see at an airport, potentially doing health screening. If that is one layer of it, then what we equally see to create that clean environment in the other side of it, where we're handling cups of water, where we're handling food, whether it's bananas, whether it's gels, whatever it might be, all of those items need to be clean items as well. And to come up with a clean item is a very complex process. We're not changing the process of, are we handing out bananas at this point? Do we need to hand out water? Do we need to hand out more or less? Whilst that stays the same, what we're looking is changing how we do those things. Sometimes sanitation is a big part of it, but mainly how we handle those things is a big part of the issue. Because to have a person handle an object that is passed on to another person, the original object can be contaminated. The gloves themselves can be contaminated from holding a contaminated object 20 minutes ago, and they've since handled another 600 cups or another 600 bananas. Everything needs to be accounted for, whether it's the cups of water, the table that it's on, the gloves that are used. So if we're looking at going down that path of having clean zones, then having some form of checkpoint that people come in and out of to be checked would certainly form part of the testing strategy. But to create that sort of clean zone, we'd also be looking at using quarantine. That would be one of the more cost-effective ways of doing it. And quarantine not by way of humans, but quarantine by way of equipment. If you put objects into a space and put a perimeter around the outside that stopped all human contact and all contact with potential virus, after a period of time, it would be free of virus. At the moment, evidence suggests that that virus is living on plastics as one of the longest surfaces at 4 to 5, maybe 6 days. There's no definitive answer on that yet. We know that it lives for approximately 24 hours on cardboard. So while it has a different life on different surfaces, there is undoubtedly a period of time that if you put objects into a space and they're not exposed to a virus, they would become clean objects. So if we're going to set up health screening in any way, shape or form in order to conduct these activities with volunteers using PPE, using water, handing them out in particular methods so that we're using no contact, food security comes into this as much as it does anywhere else, that product itself may have to be modified so that food product was suitable for quarantining for a period of time before it was handled. And therefore, we're looking at food options that are potentially different because they're no longer suitable to be stored in a period of one space for 7 days, 8 days, and still fit for consumption. So there's a lot of layers in food security as an example that when you look at handling food and getting the handlers to that food, and none of the equipment, the PPE, the vessels, the consumables itself, the people, the surfaces, anything stored on or any surface that people made contact with prior to that are contaminated in the first place. So that probably highlights how these things have to be brought together, that there is no isolated solution. There's no one single layer, and it is very much changing the fabric of how we do so many things that we're doing.
Thanks, Hugh. There's some great explanations in there. One of the questions that came up from Alessio Punzi from World Athletics, who's on the call, is, is this an opportunity for people to have a kind of a marketing angle to it? Once we get it right, there's, my event is a 5-star safety, 4-star. Then the question he immediately posed, well, then who is there to certify that you're a 5-star or a 4-star? But, I guess there's this opportunity where nervous and skeptical participants are going to say, well, Chicago is a race that you should participate in because they telegraph and communicate, what they do, and we feel comfortable going there. So it's, it's not going to just be this opportunity of we do it because we're forced to do it. We should do it because we have a duty of care. And, one of the benefits of it is potentially that it helps us to attract participants. There's lots of other, and Mike, I'm going to come back to you now if I may, but there's quite a few other tracks about, virtual events and trail running where people bring their own drinks and so on. And I think, there's no doubt in summary that the industry is going to have to evolve. Virtual events are here. Are they here to stay? We don't know. The webinar this time next week is going to be around virtual events, and there's been lots of them around, but my focus is going to try and be more on virtual events as a mechanism for engagement. I'm seeing some great virtual events coming. I'm also seeing quite a lot of virtual events that people are kind of almost putting on as a necessity. We can't hold our event, so we'll stage a virtual event, or we can't hold our event, so we'll stage a virtual event, which means that we don't need to give a refund to people. And those that are building an engagement platform around virtual events, and there's some great examples around of people that say a virtual event provides an opportunity to engage with my participants, and it will become a mix. So we have this mixed reality as a term that some people are talking about, to say, you build the virtual, and as we get past this, you'll still have the real event as we know it, albeit scaled down, and virtual might be a part of that. But Mike, maybe, pick up on any of those threads if you'd like. And you've already spoken quite a lot about staffing. So, clearly staffing and training is going to be an issue in many businesses. We've had staff that have been furloughed, reduced core teams. The planning is going to be truncated in some ways because of approval, but the time that needs to be put into planning is going to be elongated because we need to put all these extra things in place. Now is the time, whilst we have this pause, to be able to do that. And then obviously there's the training of whatever it is that we come up with, whether it's enforced on us or a collaboration or our own ideas. There's no point doing it if you're not going to train the staff to implement it properly. So just love to get some of your thoughts. And just before I throw to you, I am conscious that the hour's up, as I alluded to at the beginning. There's lots of content here. We could talk for days. So bear with us. We'll probably go another 15 minutes or so. Realize it's Friday night in some parts. If you need to drop off and go and have your virtual beer or whatever it is, no offense taken, but obviously you're welcome to stay on and listen to what else we've got to say.
Yeah, and real quick, and to the post that Alessio provided in terms of a label system to identify the different practices and the criteria that's met. I think it would be difficult and challenging. I think the label system's great to have a quality event, but when it comes to this, I think it'd be you'd have some issues from a liability standpoint, especially in terms of who's conducting that type of assessment to that level. So I just be you should definitely be cautious about what that could potentially look like. When it comes to training and the education part, there's going to be a whole lot more work that needs to go into that. And especially as we talked about now, again, you need to be sensitive in terms of how you're trying to do the recruiting during this time. And you're going to need more runway to be able to do the adequate training and education that's going to be required of your events staff, your workforce, the general volunteers, and different roles that you're going to have. And it's going to be tough because now if you are doing the recruiting, that this training is going to take some time as well, and you're going to have to do a lot more things virtually. You're going to have to take a look at different options when it comes to cost for online training that people might be required to take, since you won't be able to gather in groups to do this in person. So those are things that you're going to need to look into. And obviously just the amount of time that's going to be required to rethink and reimagine the type of training that's required. And it used to be a lot easier to be able to do aid stations, and there's not as much in-depth work that the person has to do other than pour cups, mix Gatorade or whatnot. But if we are going to require that they're going to need to do certain steps and measures as you would expect at like restaurants and food handling, there's a whole nother level of training of those supervisors, and then to the general staff or the volunteers that are going to be handling that type of product. So it's going to take a lot more time. We're already started to investigate and look to different training modules when it comes to food handling. And so how can we include and incorporate that into those practices? And even beyond this, that'll be helpful in the future, so people feel more comfortable and confident that we are handling their water and their food products more responsibly, like you would expect at a restaurant and whatnot. I did want to spend just a little bit of time, and I think one thing that we are looking at, and you don't want to be discouraging. It does sound like just so much negativity, and but we are hopeful, cautiously optimistic as well. And one thing that we've been looking at is, going through that event risk management, those templates. And I provided that, I made a comment earlier this morning for you guys, is the company Event Management, Risk Management Solutions had a really interesting graphic and table where you plug in different data sets, and it kind of gives you a better idea of, what that risk level looks like, from a high risk to medium to low. And obviously for a big event like many of our races are, you need to be in a low level to really to have your event. And unfortunately, it's like when you take a look at the models, it is strung out over time, and it's through the different quarters, and the high risk based on where we are to date with the COVID and stay-at-home orders, really doesn't have us coming out until the end of the year, beginning of next year. And it does show, and it's a good way to kind of look at what needs to take place and how we need to plan And it's going to be different based on where the region is. It's going to be different based on your state and your city and what you're allowed to do, the size of your event, and all the different data that you need to plug in. But we're going to be working with different consultants when it comes to the risk management and going through those different exercises that's specific to us and our conditions and our environment. But you're going to go through and start to identify, what is the stabilization and, the preserving. And we're in that stage now. It's like, what can you preserve? Your employees, salaries, your cancellation insurance and all those kind of things. And that's the period that we're in. And then the things that we just talked about with Hugh and Chris in terms of the training and all the different enhancements and modifications, that'll be a stage 2. And that takes time. We're talking a couple, 2-3 months. And then to reset and restart, there's the whole cancellation, postponement, and restarting the engine again, and based on these new practices, and then the whole recovery phase as we get ready to, we're ready to go with the new normal. And we're going to have a whole bunch of new processes. We're going to have a bunch of new plans to deal with this. And that's when we'll be in that recovery stage and safely be able to execute our events. So, I would suggest taking a look at those event risk models and working with either, if you have your tools, going through those exercises, or if you don't, seek out some additional support and consultants or professionals that specialize in event, the event risk management and really have a firm understanding of how to do that to help you kind of lay that out and see what's really in front of you and create that roadmap. Because it is interesting. And unfortunately, when you start to look at all this stuff in a true timeline, it is daunting. And unfortunately, it's not what we want to hear or see, but it's truly the reality that we're going to be facing.
Mike, I think without seeing it, you've probably to some degree answered the question from Gemma Mark, saying her comment was, appreciate this is around operations, but communication is key. And, there's a bunch of people looking for answers out there. When will we start? And I think, Mike's just touched the reality, Gemma. I think there's still so many unknowns. There's more questions than answers. It varies. And I know you're calling in from Limelight, if I'm correct, in the UK. Every country's got a different situation, but the reality is, I think it's going to be longer rather than sooner. And I think, the risk of trying to communicate to appease the demands of participants and making a decision for the wrong reasons right now potentially backfires down the track. I've already seen people, putting their head on the block saying we'll be going by July and we'll be there by August, and all they're doing is keep rolling these things forward. And that's been, massive organizations and small organizations in our business. There's soccer leagues that have been saying we're starting here, we're starting there. There's a bunch of other people who've said we're going to do this. A number of documented cases in Australia that NRL ended up with a lot of egg on their face, didn't they, Hugh? With, we're going to do this. So, my recommendation, without being an expert in that space, is to be more cautious, to recognize that, nobody really knows at this stage. Even the expert at the high level don't know. The health experts don't know. So how can we in the event space know? Whilst I recognize that doesn't answer your question, I just think there aren't answers to that question at the moment.
Yeah, you're right there, Chris. It is really there's a lot of unknowns still, and today we can hopefully answer at the beginning a couple of questions and leave 300 more. So following on from where Gemma was asking there are some races that clearly have a larger number of resources, and so the factor of scaling is going to be taken into account to how every event tackles this. There's also a range of non-race environment. So when we look at the environment around us, that will largely dictate a lot of the timeframes that we're starting to look at. The reality is a lot of races won't be looking at activity in 2020. By the time we look at that timeline to say, what is our decision point where we start committing, where we make financial commitment to suppliers, to partners, to marketing, and we go down that path, to have that confidence means we have to have gone through a number of steps first. And that is going to be a slow process because of the magnitude of this problem. First question is, how long is it going to take us to get a picture of what it is we're looking at? Mike's insight into his race, the more you look at it, the more you can easily become overwhelmed because of the amount of detail in everything that we do and everything that you look at. And it's not that Mike's race is alone because of the size of it. That's his context and his experience being at the front of saying these are the kinds of issues that we'd be looking at. Everyone wants to know what we're looking at by way of picture, because when you've got a picture, you start to try and put a cost to it. And I know that question will inevitably come up very soon, Chris, around how financially does it look moving forward? Do we have any guesses on it? Because we want these things to make informed decision making with the time frame that we have available. And I think for a lot of races, regardless of size, I think the nature of that external environment alone will probably dictate that 2020 is not a great year for essentially the majority of the mass participation industry. One of the models that we've been working on as a team in Singapore has really pushed the envelope on that. We've recognised that where the virus started to evolve in very late 2019 and publicly in the world in January, we, by nature of having a race in the first week of December, are probably in the best position to have a full year of lead time and warning to look at what's unfolding and start to see what it looks like for us. So we're starting that process now with more time than most other races look, and very much a race in 2020 is possible. But there's a range of factors that we look at in Singapore to say, these are the reasons it works for us, whereas on the same weekend in so many parts of the world, it probably is not a feasible option. Singapore is an island state. It's got great border control. It has a long history of successful management of disease outbreak for a number of decades. It's a very well publicised and very proud reputation from what it achieved through SARS, MERS, swine flu, a number of different biological issues and health issues. So the resources around Singapore and those who are familiar with Singapore are very aware of the efficiency that the country runs at because of the nature of its size and being an island. So we're looking at a race environment in that particular setting where we've got 12 months of time to understand what the picture might look like, therefore work out what really the costs look like accurately. And we've probably got the longest lead time out of a majority of industry to make a decision as to whether we're in a position to go ahead with whatever measures do make up that fabric. Gemma's question keeps leading on for days on end. We could keep going, as Mike alluded, on any of these topics, and timelines is no different. It does naturally take time for us to go through this process, and it's a natural evolution that we move through that process, understanding the picture before we can cost it and make informed decision making. And I think the sad reality for a number of races is that 2020 is probably a bridge too far. I'd love to be wrong and find out there's more going ahead than what we're looking at the moment. But the reality is it's a very big unknown picture with some costs associated with it, Chris, that I'm sure we're going down momentarily and to make informed decision making.
Thanks, Hugh. And yeah, I realise it's we're already 15:15, and you know, with everyone's with Mike, you're okay to stay another 5-10 minutes, Hugh?
Yeah, I got another call in 15 minutes, but yeah, I got a few minutes here.
Okay, let's just quickly try and wrap it up. Let's make that one the last one. Then, you know, we touched on that this morning, and I think unfortunately the budget question is the same as many of the other questions: is how long is a piece of string? But Mike, you had some great insights this morning. You know, there might be some people there being freaked out saying it's a bunch of extra budget. Your feeling is that there might be some ways, well, particularly for a big event like you that had some other initiatives, that you may be able to, you know, redirect budget. But, you know, just some sense about budget in a couple of minutes, please.
Yeah, and again, it's all scalable, and we might have, you know, more resources and are able to do some new initiatives and set aside money to continue to do enhancements. And I think all of us like to enhance and improve our events, and we might set aside money or budget to be able to include or incorporate those. So what we've done is we've, ensured that if there's anything new, the nice to haves, we're kind of just shrinking those and knowing that we're going to reapply those funds and that budget towards things that we know that we're going to need to have: the additional hand washing, additional sanitization, additional maintenance, PPE equipment, etc. So at least it's a trade-off, and there's not going to be what we feel a massive increase in cost. But again, we're figuring that part out, and but at least it won't be just a brand new cost, because we do have budgets to offset that. You do need to take a look at your financial models, the impact of lost revenue. You might have a cap field, but doesn't mean everyone's going to show up. And then someone did post here in terms of one of the options, and we've always built in a deferment process, and people have the option to know that they're not going to be able to run this year. Can I get a guaranteed entry next? We did talk about some other races that could, send out a questionnaire just to find out if people are planning to still travel to your event. And it gives you a better sense of like how many people you're going to be dealing with. And if it is, and granted, and we know it's going to just the nature of what's happening with the spring events going to the fall, you're not going to have as many people that are going to be in Chicago because of that. Also, just concerns that people will have to travel and being in mass gatherings. That based on that, your field size will shrink. But that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Yeah, from a revenue it would be, but also there could be cost savings. One, smaller fields give you more space. Two, if you can catch it in time and know when you ask that question, you can reduce the type of resources necessary. If you haven't ordered t-shirts, medals, food, water, etc., product, you can reduce that inventory. So you have an opportunity to adjust and reduce those expenses if you can get in front of it soon enough. So again, those are things that we continue to work on. Look and reforecast your revenue models, reforecast your budgets, and where you're spending and how you're spending your money, and look and take a look at your field size. And again, when you can bring down your field size from a product standpoint, amenity standpoint, volunteer standpoint. So if your model includes donations to groups based on head counts, if you reduce your workforce management, you can reduce the number of donations that are made, event staffs that's required. So again, you need to take a look at everything, and and what's going to benefit your event from a financial aspect.
Thanks, Mike. Might just go to a quick wrap. It's 20 past. Mike's got to get to another call. We could talk for ages. So I think, just really in terms of summary, I hope it's been useful. I'm sorry that some of you maybe didn't get the answers that you might have been looking for. The reality is that this is very complex. It's multi-layered. It's an opportunity for collaboration and cooperation. I would really encourage you in your particular markets to try and get groups of industry leaders to go and lobby, whether it's in a city, whether it's in a country. We have an opportunity here, as the title is, getting on the front foot. And that's not necessarily, or not at all, intended to be a conflict situation. This is not about us going and knocking heads with government agencies. It's about us taking this opportunity to say, how can we collaborate globally? One of the thoughts I had this morning, we haven't even confirmed it, but I think it might be great if Mike and Hugh are available to, bring this together again in a month's time and see maybe how much we've progressed. And it's going to be these ongoing collaborations around the industry. It's not necessarily a one size fits all. Some of the positives, testing is improving. There may be some opportunities around the testing if we need to get there. Obviously, training is going to be challenging. Staffing is going to be challenging. So making the use of the timing that you have at this stage to get the best out of your teams. Have a look at some of those risk management profiles. Mike alluded to the 4 different stages. I think the reality is, and I agree with what both Mike and Hugh were alluding to, I think 2020 is going to be pretty tough for many events, and starting to look ahead and have a plan B and a plan C. We're here to help. I'll call on Monday again, Strength in Numbers, 8:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. Singapore time if you'd like to join. My email, chris@chrisrobb.asia. If there's anything that I can help with, please feel free, drop me a direct email. Thank you so much. It's great to have seen so many people hang on the call at this time. Thanks, Mike, so much for staying up late and getting up early. And Hugh, for you can go and have that Friday night beer in Perth now. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Be safe and all the very best. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone.
Chris.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Bye.